right back over to Mr. Snooker.
All right, so it's not so much American history as it is trying to help you understand to see how church history has influenced American history. And we're going to be looking at how that should be equated or used to promote America as a Christian nation. That's not what I'm going to do right now, but I want us to just continue to build deeper into how the spirit of the church was fundamentally a part of the spirit of America. This may seem to be a little bit redundant right now, a little re-emphasis of some of the last session, but the point being is I need to ask you, how successful are true conversions in forming leadership in the direction that would please God in a pluralistic society? Let me say that again. How successful are true conversions in forming leadership to give direction in a pluralistic society? Because we do know that Washington, the capital of our country, and every state capital and every legislative body, each well-meaning, God-fearing people alive sometimes. It's just the point is, don't bring up your religion. Don't bring up what you believe. But you have to see it was so ingrained in our thinking. If we look at the Puritan spirit of true religion and expository preaching and systematic theology, were so much a part of how people heard the Word of God. I'm an expositor. I just finished at our church a 2-year through the whole Bible survey that I wrote and committed myself to teaching to our a Bible group. But that wasn't expository. That was just a survey. Expository is basically the line upon line, precept upon precept. You see this in your notes here. You have a sheet that gives you some scripture verses. And in Isaiah 28 says, "For it is precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little, for by people of strange lips and with a foreign tongue the Lord will speak to this people, to whom he has said, this is rest. Give rest to the weary. This is repose. Yet they would not hear." Because God's really asking a lot of us to listen to him. That's why these things seem redundant and repeated twice. "And the word of the Lord will be to them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little, that they may go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken." I mean, this is a really emphatic point being made by Isaiah that it takes a long time for us to get it. But that's the kind of preaching that went on back in the day. In fact, Acts chapter 20 reminds us too that the Apostle Paul saw this of necessity to the Ephesians, verse 20, or chapter 20, and again in your notes. "And now, behold, I know that none of you among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom will see my face again. Therefore I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all, for I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God." And this is how preaching was back in Puritan America and in early Baptist, Reformed Baptist churches. And even Episcopal churches at that time, because you remember the Episcopals were breaking away from the Roman Catholics, and the point of separation was on the authority of Scripture. So sometimes we lump the Episcopals up into this ball that belongs with the Catholics, but no, the early Episcopals, Anglicans, were devoted to the Word of God. And they also were devoted to the understanding of the covenant and the meaning of the covenant. The logic of the covenant is definitely that you understand you're in a contractual agreement with people of the same faith. This is when you get married, your contractual agreement is based on love to the end, through better for worse, sickness, health, richer or poorer. And so the logic of the covenant is a very important aspect that carries two main points: responsibility and accountability. I read a book some time ago called The Fierce Communion. It was written by a secular teacher, I think, with Yale or Harvard, and she posits the fact that the reason, here's a secularist now to say, the reasons the Puritans were so successful in their community is that they held to a fierce communion. That's the title of the book, The Fierce Communion. And the idea of a fierce communion is that, and I'll maybe mention it in the third hour, but is that you are holding one another to the high standards that the world does not even think of, right? We just look line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. God's standards are high. And the fierce communion was acknowledging the aspect of, I am my brother's keeper. Now, let's just kind of fast forward a little bit in your own experience in American culture before all this wokeness and all this PC stuff. I grew up in a neighborhood. If I had my folks they didn't go to church once, C&E, Christmas and Easter kind of a thing. But if I had a Jewish neighbor scold me for doing something on his lawn or to his property, my parents would have given me the gangster slap, just the same. Because there was this common respect within the community that age and authority and right should be rewarded or unrighteous punished. And so my dad would happily be in favor of the neighbor who he didn't agree with on anything to give me a gangster slap or send me home crying. I got so many stories like that. I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, so the Joyzy thing will come out. But it's just really responsibility. Let me just give you two quick definitions here. Responsibility is to know the commitment and live by it at all cost. That's what responsibility is. To know the commitment. This is to anything. And live by it at all cost. I spent 22 years in manufacturing as a machinist and a welder and a tool maker. And the responsibility that goes with that kind of thing is follow the blueprints, wear eye protection, and don't put your fingers where they're going to wind up not being attached to your hand anymore. I mean, that's not real hard to figure out. A great deal of respect, right? That's the responsibility. But the accountability side is to do the things agreed upon with others and to uphold them at all cost. So in the fierce communion, the idea, I am my brother's keeper, meant something. But now in our politically correct, woke-charged world, it's an offensive thing for you to point out someone's error. And I can go on and on. Everybody gets a trophy, right? And everybody's a winner. It's not true. If you've been around long enough, you know who the losers are. But you don't have to point them out. And in the older way, you would be a good person if you said, I don't think you're doing this right, ma'am. Can I just offer a little insight? And if you knew that I was a respectable individual, you'd say, what is it, Tom, that you see? Well, it's just something about your garden or the way your fence is or your gate swinging the wrong way. I don't know. But now, who are you to tell me what to do? Get off my property. I'll call the police, And I've seen police, and I've done some ride-alongs, and I know some of the calls they get is like, really? You called the police? Okay, man, what is it? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we'll look into it. Gets back into the car. What a doofus. And they just drive away. So even people in law enforcement know that some of this has just gone too far. And everybody wants a shoulder to cry on and put a complaint on file. All right, but the post-Great Awakening, which is our next thing here, I get lost there. I don't want to be guilty of too many rabbit trails. But you get the idea between responsibility and accountability. So the post-Great Awakening spirit, as this infects America here, is found in three elements, okay? True conversions, new churches, and new schools. And I know I've talked a little bit about conversions and the record of conversions, such made by Jonathan Edwards, but the influence in society by Christ-centered beliefs will model itself in a culture. So if you look at what it says here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, it says, and you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit, that you became an example of all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. For not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. In other words, what Paul is saying, your Christian testimony is clearly what it should be, but it's also been an influence. People don't need to say, we think they're Christians, right? They know they're Christians. In Macedonia and Achaia, their testimony is clear. So true conversions, this was something that could be seen. It's a true versus nominal. True churches. There were true gospel churches in the presence of biblical conscience in Americans. The influence of true gospel presence and biblical conscience in America. I can go on and on, but from Jonathan Edwards' family line is a guy by the name of Timothy Dwight, who was a professor, or actually the president of Yale, and a long legacy of different individuals who influenced society and education through churches. It could be said that a gathering of social Christianity in the time after the First Great Awakening usually meant that there was going to be discussion about the Bible. But after just a couple of generations, it just became a gathering for a potluck. And maybe God would be brought up in the beginning, Lord bless the food, and make sure everybody gets home safely, or something like that. So, it's not to disrespect the presence of God in community, but it didn't take long. And listen, if you know anything about the Bible, the book of Judges is certainly a reminder that it doesn't take long for the faithful to fall apart in just a generation or so. And again, new schools, as we pointed out before, the influence of new schools and how the teachings we talked about in the first hour, the importance of a true classical scholasticism in balancing education, right? I want you to remember that. That's a very important point to bring up, as Pastor Mike talked about, when you get in contact discussions with people. Say, we're not even really teaching our kids today, because the two most fundamental things are what? Word and numbers. Logic and, coming to a sum or a conclusion through how numbers prove things. We have a verifiable world. But because it's faith-based, people want to say, no, you can't know these things. Oh, yeah, well, these things are written that you might know that Jesus is the Christ, and believing in his name you will have life. So there is a knowable thing in the unseen world. Though we have not seen him, we love him. And I can go on. But you get the point. The new schools, the influence of the Judeo-Christian ethic in academic and worldview consciousness was very apparent. Even up to the we're going to say 1900, because when we get a little bit further down here, you're going to see where the break happens. But even though the departure from classical education starts to take place in the later part of the 19th century, the moral Christian embeddedness in the national conscience is still around. As I said before, people who don't go to church know Scripture. There are people who don't care about God who still will cite moral virtue that they don't even know they're quoting Scripture. And then America went on a little bit further in its development of true patriotism or true piety. Now this becomes the litmus test. Okay? Here in our early American culture, we have, I always love doing this. This is one of the greatest quizzes ever to give somebody. All right? So you got the $1 bill, and you got all written all over this, God we trust, and we got this really weird side with Sepsis and Nova Seclorum, or Nova Oro Seclorum, Latin on the back here. And, how many really know what all that means? You know how to spend it, right? Hey, we know how to spend it, but we don't know how to defend it or even talk about it. Because this is where the consciousness of the early fathers had indebted themselves to communicating what they believed to be timeless attributes to a well-organized country, a nation that saw itself with purpose. And, well, I know it septis basically means God favor our undertakings, okay? The favor of providence is where we see even the deists like Franklin and Jefferson would recognize the favor of the Creator. Remember when I talked about the importance of natural law? People got natural law because natural law is all about natural consequences. And so this little saying here, I know it's septis, favor providence or for our undertakings, was a spiritual mindset of early American thought. And as well, Novus Ordo Seclorum is a new order for the ages. Now, some people say the New World Order is in there. That's not really what they had in mind. They didn't have apocalyptic theology. What they saw with the American Democratic Republic was a new way of doing things. And how? We saw from the last hour, it was because they understood the called to be salt and light in the world. And the argument was that, even like John Eliot said, we're not here to defend the Massachusetts colony, but to defend the Algonquin Indians who God sent us here to save. What an order, huh? That's a different order of priorities. We're here because of God sending us here to do bigger work than build a community. He wants us to have a city on a hill that will shine. You see, this is where if we lose these bearings, then we easily fall into patriotism. God has put us in the place where we live, like I said here in Acts chapter 17, remember? A determined, allotted period, boundaries, and our dwelling place, so that we would seek God and perhaps feel our way towards Him. So keeping these things in concert with the focus of a both and, not an either or, will help us understand where we're going to go even in the next hour. So the evidence of the importance of united, the evidence of the importance of a unified and united currency with a unified message on the currency finds it to be very interesting for a people who have a history without shame to say, in God we trust. Now there are state seals and city emblems and county emblems and seals. There's a lot of them throughout our country that have that phrase, in God we trust. Some of them are being taken to court, as maybe this week, because somebody got offended, because I don't trust in God. Well, fine, don't then. I always get a funny thing about atheists. They don't believe in God, yet they want to bring them up. How do you bring up something you don't believe in? Other than you're just annoyed by it. But get over it. It's like, I don't care who beat the Cavs. It's not going to change my life. All right? You get what I'm saying? People just want to find something to complain about. Now, I make this point because the national sense of the divine was very prevalent in the corporate and collective national conscience without shame. And the Great Seal has been around since 1795, and the In God We Trust has been around since 1864. So with America's growth and all that came with it, America starts now on this roll to become internationally recognized. The international recognition of the United States technically begins with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, when England severed its ties with America, gave it its freedom, blah, blah, blah. But the official world stage presence of America as an independent nation in the eyes of national sovereignty and power comes after the War of 1812, when the British are defeated a second time and the Treaty of Ghent is signed in December 1814. And with that, the ability of the Americans to trade with people, sail freely across the seas, because at this particular time before the War of 1812, there were these things called impressments, where the British would seize sailors off of American ships and make them serve on British ships. It was basically human trafficking and piracy, and all wrapped up in one, in the name of law, because there's no law on the high seas, right? Or lawlessness, I mean. So what happens after the War of 1812 is this period known as the era of good feelings. And it's also, though, the time of the democratization of the church. What does democratization mean? It means your voice has a say in how things are run. Now, let me just give you a spoiler alert. It's not our church. It's Christ's bride. Okay? It is God's sovereign instrument in this world, okay, to dictate and provide salt and light, the gospel of truth, world without end, amen, amen, Jesus is coming again. Okay? It's not all wrapped up in one very clear biblical thing that we should grasp. Now, has God chosen ways in which men and women can be involved in the management of the church? Yes, because He's given us gifts and callings. He's given us the abilities to know power and authority, but with power and authority comes what? Responsibility and accountability. So as soon as your pastor, who is a godly man, can lead you in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake, gets off on his own little rabbit trail of power brokering or, collective bargaining on little special interest groups, he becomes a criminal in the church of God. He does. He becomes nothing short of the money exchangers at the temple, trying to make the best of being in the position looking like, I'm with God on this. And this was starting to happen a lot in America at this time in the churches because Americans were starting to feel their oats, starting to feel their freedoms, and we see this in the Jacksonian period known to be introduced through rugged individualism. And Jackson's the perfect guy to be the model for rugged individualism. I mean, he grew up on the frontier of South Carolina, confronted a British officer when he was a boy who didn't want to polish his shoes, and the officer took his sword out, slashed Jackson, had a nice little scar on his head, because the boy Jackson said, hey, you're not going to tell me what to do, He could have been from New Jersey, for all I know, But anyway, he shows this kind of, this panache for being up front and being bold. And so that's the kind of guy we want. We want somebody, a rugged individual who's an American, who can tell the British where to go and not only stand up to them once, but beat them again at the Battle of New Orleans. That's what we want. And that's what we do aspire to being identified with. I mean, the only reason the Chicago Cubs lasted as long in baseball as the lovable losers is just because people felt sorry for them. But there's been many franchises in baseball and other sports have not lasted because they were losers. You don't gravitate to losers. And so you're trying to see here, hopefully with me, the power of influence and the power of characteristics that are demonstrated in a quality leader, but we can lose sight of who the better leader is. And his name happens to be Jesus. Okay? It's really easy to lose sight of Jesus when there's a lot of big shots in the forum. So this is also a period where we get what's called conflicted morality. The dichotomy of political license, which is this conflicted dual morality. Who I am in office is not who I am in private life. So don't you worry about who I am and what I do. I mean, Jackson would never be elected today in America, no matter how many good things he did. He killed a man in a duel. He called a man out who made fun of his wife and shot him dead. Now, we'd say, yeah, my kind of American, okay? And if that's the kind of people we want to identify with, that's okay. But is that really the Christian conscience we want to take into in the realm and the forum of discussion with all that's going on in our world? And that's why sometimes we gravitate to people who are brash and bold. We just like that, But I say all this here because this is how politicians can, in good conscience, get a vote for abortion, even when they say, well, in my Christian world. So they're getting an abortion vote because they want to placate everybody. But, I'm really a Catholic or I'm really this or that. Am I ringing any familiar bells? Yeah. Scary times. Well, then also we get the denominational corporate identities, personalities, or theology. And again, this is where in the history of the church in America, we lose sight of truth when we have personalities to gravitate, not only politically in Andrew Jackson, but we have, like, in denominational corporate identities, like a Charles Finney, who is one of the great leaders of the Second Great Awakening. We have Finians out here anywhere? People familiar with Charles Finney? Anyone? Well, Charles Finney was a lawyer by trade. And one of his famous ways of putting the message across is that he, as a preacher, became the prosecuting attorney. And you, defendants, are guilty. And you are found wanting for a need of an advocate, for your case is condemnable, and you will go to eternal hell if you don't convert. And he draw people to mercy. No, did I make a point? Did you see how if I'm the prosecuting attorney in a courtroom, I can make the innocent feel guilty by shaming them? And so he becomes a very powerful spokesperson on how to do that and how to win people. I mean, there were so many different kinds of things that could be attributed to his style. One of them is known as the anxious bench. This is when people start to come forward to make decisions for Christ. And, I'll be scared and wondering and quaking about, am I found guilty and I'll be judged. I mean, there were camp retreats in different places throughout Kentucky and Tennessee and Southern Ohio, the burned over district in New York. This was a sweep of things that were happening where people were emotionally thrown into a decision without much theological logic and systematic theology and an expository message like Jonathan Edwards would have gave. So you can understand how this worked. Sometimes there would be 3 or 4 camp meetings going on within a general county with upwards to 10 to 20,000 people. Now, this is back in the 1800s when you went 5 miles meant you really had to go out of the way. Get the wagon up. Wrap the kids up. Bring the lunch. Because 5 miles in a buckboard wagon isn't like going to Menard at Aldi's. Okay? You know what I'm talking about. Especially because kids even then said, when are we going to get there? And then after you're there, you're listening not to a 35-minute sermon. You're there from sunup to sundown for a week, listening to preachers yell at you and holler at you and telling you you're going to hell and all this kind of stuff, based on this style of preaching. And get a decision. Go back. Start a church. I don't know if you've ever done much riding around in West Virginia and in Appalachia, but there's a lot of churches that are half this size, meeting in Possum Trot or Podunk. And they're there because they're still there because Uncle Clyde and Wilbur started this church. And we've been figuring we'll be here as a bastion for Christ until he comes. And who all comes? Well, Hetty comes, and Elmer comes, and there's like 6 people all related, And it's just it's a result of what happened during this period of time. I'm serious. And so anyway, this was an important thing going on. It was the event mentality that drove people to make decisions for Christ as well. Just like it was in the earlier first awakening, it's good to get together, hear a good message, but when are we going to have the picnic? It's a cultural part of America. When I did some short-term missions work in Slovakia, and Europeans are a lot different after church. They don't do the same things we do after church. They usually go back to their families. But America has a little bit of a different kind of a way to go and do things together on more regular events and build community in different ways. They didn't have to build community in Slovakia. It's been around for 1,000 years, right? We replaced the Huns and the Goths with Christians. Here in America, everything's new. But then there's this other thing here, American cultural nativism. Nativism is a very, very weird part of American spiritual culture. I have a book here. It was published in 1928, I think, or thereabouts. And 1938. And it's called The Protestant Crusade. And in this book is just a whole bunch of things that talk about how Christians in America who were born in America are the real gatekeepers for America. And it goes on, it talks about the first American Republican Party, started in Philadelphia, about the framing of institutions not bound to consult or judgment, where evils can be complained about but need to be rectified. And the remedies we propose, now this is church-based, the remedies we propose to fix in America is to extend the period of naturalization, elect none but Native Americans, not the Indian kind, but the natives born in America, and to reject foreign interference from all of our institutions, social, religious, and political. So there's an awful lot in this book, which goes on to show that there was already a cadre of Americans starting to form the idea and the consensus, if we're going to preserve America the way we're supposed to in the name of God, we got to vet who comes. We got to sort it out before we allow them to be a part of our country. And so whatever's going on in our country right now is not new. And one of the first groups of people to be vetted and looked down upon were Irish Catholics in the 1840s. Now, remember I said the Spanish Catholics had a lot to do with the development of a version of Christianity in the New World, but they were limited to the south of the part of the United States from Florida over to Mexico and Southern California. And that the English and the Dutch had the success to the north because of the Spanish Armada was defeated in 1588 and they had control of the seas. But in this second wave of Catholics to America, now they're landing on a United States of America soil. And they're landing in the area where there's English and Dutch and Germans who are used to an America free of Catholics. The only Catholic institution as such in the United States at this time that had any large representation was the state of Maryland. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't Catholics scattered throughout America. But to get hundreds, if not thousands, of Irish speakers who hate English and English hate them, starting to fill the city streets, it became a problem. And so this is one of the ways that in our first attempt to kind of minimize immigrants was this political party called the American Republicans, which had a Christian bent to it. There was also a time when the Americans didn't like French coming in, but that's another story. That was around 1810. But this 1840s is a real stage now where this whole sense of I'm an American, I'm a Christian, and this is how it ought to look starts. And it's from a book, you can find it by Billingston, called The Protestant Crusade. All right, so another thing that happened too was the importance of seeing the Manifest Destiny spirit, what it was. What was the Manifest Destiny and why was this so important? And again, time's getting away from us so quickly. But the Manifest Destiny was the right to claim America's land from sea to shining sea in the name of God. From 1845, John Lewis O'Sullivan, a New York journalist, wrote this, and this was pretty much believed by everybody. When he wrote this, it was like, wow, this is what we need. This gives us license. This is how we should run the show. From John Lewis O'Sullivan, quote, "Our manifest destiny is to overspread and process the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us," unquote. You could find that online, okay, from John O'Sullivan, 1845. So what was it? Well, it was a statement that people long to qualify their actions with. We're going to take America. We're going to do what we can to have everything from sea to shining sea. It served notice also to the Native Americans. Join us or be removed. And there were American military officers who just simply were quoted saying, the only good Indian is a what kind of Indian? A dead one. I mean, these are documented statements. If they don't comply, they're easily killed. It was just a very racial attempt. Now, and these are by some who would call themselves Christians. These are West Point graduates who understood America's history and also America's history with relationship to its Puritan and Protestant perspectives. See, the problem of the Manifest Destiny was people were blindsided with the sense of an obligation to fulfill a divine calling. God gave it to us, we better do it. God's given us this land, these are just savages in between. Let's take the land. So really, the church was hijacked in this whole thing too. The church was hijacked in the idea that not only is this a political and expedient thing to do to secure our borders, but it's also a divine mandate, without question. Look, we're superior, they're weak. We have guns, they have bows and arrows. Who wins? And that was the logic. Don't mistake me for, trying to sound like I'm being bombastic. This is the thought. You read the literature of this time, and there was no second thought of how well the American spirit needed to be carried at the expense of the Native Americans. And if you ever hear about the massacre of Wounded Knee, you can see how it all ended without a whole lot of compunction, without a whole lot of second thought. to massacre and kill 260 Native Americans who were defenseless, men, women, and children. So, we also have to remember, too, spiritual rights of individualism and spirituality of America defined by a civil war. Now, not only are we amped up to secure our borders and think we are in the right, we can't even get along with each other. We can't even see through the facts that we have become angry with our own interpretation of how America should look. I mean, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but anybody who's been a Christian for any length of time has probably been through a church split or been close to one. And it's usually about some insignificant substance with regard to how it's managed. Now, a church split over a doctrinal issue, I'm in favor for it. You have some idiot who denies the deity of Christ, boot him out or follow the right guy. But when it comes over, well, we spent too much on the parking lot last year. Why do we need a new coffee maker? And things like that. So when you look at what was dividing America, there was two things here. The states' rights versus human rights. Again, are these things that are defendable? Is there an inalienable component and a legal component in these arguments? I'm not going to discuss them. It'd be great third-hour stuff. But there's winners and losers. And the power to enforce the lost cause, the Confederacy, was doomed to fail because it failed to meet the moral criteria in the approach to using states' rights as the badge of honor. States' rights is a badge of honor, but to use something that is righteous to support an unrighteous cause becomes a problem. In fact, at the end of the Civil War, from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, he said these famous words, which really are a Bible study in themselves. Just listen and quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to work and finish what we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who is still born the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations," unquote. Because earlier in the inaugural address, he said, isn't it strange that we both pray to the same God, asking one to defeat the other? So he sums it up. This is the shortest inaugural address in American history. Look at this thing. This is a president. That's it. This is it. That's the whole inaugural address. They wouldn't even have the cameras set up before he was done today. So, yeah. Anyway, we move on because you can get where I'm going, I think, hopefully. Post-Civil War Reconstruction spirit, the legacy of Lincoln, we can just leave that off. I think you're familiar with what he did. But Lincoln does play a part, though he's not necessarily associated with a church and never made a doctrinal statement that would satisfy an evangelical. He sure could quote Scripture, and he also made his point in the second inaugural address. And the black community saw him as a Moses type who led them out of the wilderness or of bondage and of Egypt and slavery, and the year of Jubilee was upon them. That was a very common black community statement about Abraham Lincoln, that he brought us to the year of Jubilee. But not only should we consider this, but there's new constitutional amendments, too, that qualify some kind of moral righteousness now being overseen by the U.S. Constitution, ending slavery in the 13th, granting citizenship in the 14th, and the right to vote in the 15th for the black man, but not for the woman. So you got some real hypocrisy going on in some of these places. And then the question is, was Reconstruction a success? Well, the answer is not really. Because what had happened, the Civil War lasted 4 years and Reconstruction lasted for 12. And during the Reconstruction, things like the Ku Klux Klan started up. Segregation started up. A lot of things that went backwards from where originally in colonial America there were free blacks. Yes, there was slavery, but there were more free blacks in colonial America than there were slaves at one time. It was only just by virtue of economics like tobacco that slavery increased. And not until later, when the cotton gin was developed, that slaves were needed to do more harvesting, that slavery increased in the South to 4 million. So when the war was ended and Reconstruction tried to bind the nation's wound, what was really weird that happened is it recreated what is known, and you can look this up in a history book, called the Solid South. The South became solidly Democratic for 100 years. And there were blacks who were Republicans who tried to run for office in different places in the South in the first 12 years, supported by almost an army presence. There were U.S. soldiers present in southern cities for 12 years after the Civil War. I've been overseas after the fall of communism. It's a weird feeling. It's one thing to go to a military day parade and say, oh, look at the soldiers, aren't they cool? But it's another thing to be in a country where they're walking around with their AK-47s like this, where there's 3 or more people gathered. No, we don't want that. So, it was a police state kind of in the South for a while, which embedded even more a hatred for them Yankees. Beat us, get out of our country. Go back up to Ohio and New York. And for 12 years. And it wasn't until 1877 when there was the Great Compromise after an election. It looked like a flipped election that William Tyndall, I forget his first name, Tilden, should have won. But there was a big negotiation and Rutherford B. Hayes won. And a Great Compromise was achieved. And so they pulled the troops out of the South. Well, once the troops were pulled out of the South, you think the Baptist churches are going to say, let's take care of all the black folk now. We're going to be real good, No, unfortunately, I hope I'm not sounding too cruel, but it happened. Now, there were some good black relationships with the church and good Baptist churches, okay? I lived in the South for a while, and it's still really weird. I grew up and I saw what those 2 different kind of water fountains look like. I know what that can look like in America. And it's when the church isn't there that that kind of thing happens. So the Solid South was a recast for Democrats for 100 years. The nature of the federal government changed the country forever, and the use of the word union is replaced now with the nation. Sentences that used to be the United States are becomes the United States is. Check it out. I'm not telling you anything that is hidden. People in America before the Civil War said the United States are a collection of states. And after 1877, the language changes. The United States is one nation. So Americans to go through this and then the expansionist spirit and urban to global missions development. This is where it really gets hot. And I'll go as quickly as I can here, hopefully not lose you. The defeat and destruction of the Native American as a person under Christian leadership is certainly one of the most egregious things that's ever happened in our nation's history. And you heard me earlier in the first hour how indebted some men were, like David Brainerd and John Eliot, to the saving of the souls of Indians. The divide and conquer worked. They lost land and they lost their dignity for the most part. They lost land because the reservations are technically, and you can look this up, and some of them are still designated, they didn't change the language, of prisoner of war camps. That's what reservations were, prisoner of war camps. There was an American native named Red Jacket who simply said in one of these removal of people, you know about the Trail of Tears and all that kind of stuff, in one of these movements of people from one area to the other, like the Shawnee of Ohio wound up in northern Kansas, near Kansas City, Kansas. That's not where they grew up. That's not their land. But Red Jacket said in one of these movements when they were being confronted and the people were shaking their head and he said, well, what do you have to say for yourself and all this? See where you are. He said this to some commanding officer. You should read that little black book that you gave us. Imagine that, an American native saying that. Red Jacket, check it out. You should read that little black book you gave us. Loss of land, the relocation. And then there was the re-education. This always goes when a country conquers people, re-educating. I'm reading this book called 3,000 Years of Espionage, and I've just finished a chapter on how Soviets would train new agents. Their training is intense. we did this to Native Americans. We shipped them out from the plains, from Minnesota to the Dakotas, and sent them to Carlisle, Pennsylvania to Americanize them, cut their hair and teach them English. So send them back to be good Indians. And most of them went back with no identity. Is that Christian? And there would be chapels and everything. How many have ever heard of the Carlisle Indian School? It's almost like an internment camp. It's a sad story in American history. Well, anyway, 20th century spirit, industrial and more individual influences. A lot can be said here. Immigration 2.0 or 3.0, actually, another wave of Roman Catholics come into America. And there's now what some would say an economic betrayal on the wealth of America by the robber barons, where people start to be taken advantage of and worked at ridiculous wages. Where was the Christian witness in all this? Unions had their place, for sure. I don't doubt that. But there's not a lot of Christian witness against the over-abuse of individuals in the workplace and then exploiting immigrants who would work and do anything. That the most frightening one, though, is influences of international ideologies. This is when people from overseas start to come to America and complain and basically say, you know, Christianity didn't work too well in Europe. It's not working too well here. You need to be re-educated. And things like higher criticism starts to show up in colleges. So this whole thing, again, more and more can be said, and I want to be careful of the time. Give me another couple of minutes here. I'll make a few points. The 20th century, this is where not only what we learned about how nativism affected the American church through things like the American Republican Party, but how the 20th century spirit brings together so many things. We're almost in our lifetime. This may make me sound really old, but my great-grandfather was born in 1856. My great-grandfather was born in 1856. That's hard to believe, it is. I can document it. But my grandparents were late 1890s and early 19th. And I know of the three of my grandparents who come from Europe, the whole of the way America seemed to them was so different than Europe. And I used to hear those stories all the time. But America was already surrendering to some of these European liberal ideologies with the rise of progressivism and the social gospel. I didn't put that on there. Rise of progressive and social gospel. There's this guy by the name of Walter Rauschenbusch. Anyone ever hear Walter Rauschenbusch? How's that? That's a mouthful. He was all for the social gospel. Feed them, and they'll be won by our feeding. And that may be a case, but that doesn't give you points for your own salvation if you just feed the poor. You got to give them the gospel, right? Good works and soup kitchens became the part of Walter Rauschenbusch's thesis for the social gospel. He was a Baptist, by the way. And you have modernity versus fundamentalism. This is a whole other subject. But the modernists were saying things like, okay, look, if you get rid of the Bible and disprove the Bible, it's a natural descent. You get rid of the Bible, you get rid of the miracles, you get rid of, the virgin birth, you get rid of Jesus, you get rid of salvation, you get rid of heaven. Forget it. It's all over. And people bought into it. Even liberal churches bought into it. Again, that's a whole other lesson I don't want to get into. I'm sorry. But then you have, in a counter to this, though, the rise of Bible conferences and institutes. This is when Moody Bible Institute starts. This is when great Bible conferences take place. How many of you have ever been to a Bible conference that's lasted a week? Nobody? That's how far removed we are. That was commonplace. Started on Sunday night, would end on Friday night. A whole week of Bible conferences. I remember a church I pastored in Michigan, we tried it for from Sunday night to Wednesday. And it was a struggle to get people out 4 nights in a row. It really was. What made it easy on the last night is I gave away a Lamborghini. No, I'm like... But you had to have food all the time and a good reason to be out there. I wasn't into clowns and balloons and things like that. It's hard. And here I am in a group of people, that should know that this was something had happened, and it hasn't happened. But during that time, good preaching, more conversions, and then we get to World War I. And that's where a lot falls apart. And again, from normalcy to naivety, the 1920s, are just an incredible period of time in the American church. Multi-ethnic and cultural diversity happens because more and more immigrants now are coming. People are leaving Europe because it's war-torn. The effects of the Roaring '20s are crazy. I mean, people are just so free about what they do. But there's this thing like prohibition to try to keep people down, and alcoholism rises up. Did you know that? Alcoholism increased during Prohibition because it's our nature to want to do something to get around the law. And the gangsters in the underworld bloomed during that period of time. Time prohibits me giving you another story. But again, worldliness in the American Christian spirit was starting to take place. With World War I behind us, the big question in the 1920s, where was God? I mean, people were actually calling the battlefields of Europe, like Ypres and Marne and Verdun, like the apocalypse. It was the end of the world. And where's God? How did 1.3 million men die in a 3-month campaign? Where's God? So it was very easy for people to say, well, I guess he didn't show up. There was a war going on. He didn't hear about it. And so let's get drunk. Let's make money. I mean, I'm making a kind of a collective maybe stereotype of some things. There were godly people, certainly. But what the main driving voice was the voice of discontent, which had the radio, which had the power of politicians who could easily stifle the little guy. So the American church, it went through a great deal, and with respect to other things too, like the Scopes trial. How many know about the Scopes trial, the monkey trial? And that was something that, the fundamentalists, basically, the Bible believers, won the court case but lost the battle, because we all looked like simpletons who need more education because all that learning you got down in Tennessee wasn't enough, so they got made fun of. And then, again, the Great Depression is a really weird thing to study. I'll just say this, and we'll wrap this up here. The successes in America's Great Depression are minimal with respect to the church. This was a great time for the church to rise up, and it didn't. What replaced the church's influence in America? Social programs under FDR. The New Deal. We'll fix it. Remember, it's almost like what Ronald Reagan said later. The words you want to hear that cause you the most fear are the words, we're the government and we're here to help. And so this was the era when that began, and I think the failure is that the church continued to miss the opportunity to be the church, and while it was doing that, infighting were taking place between fundamentalists and the new evangelicals. So that's another subject, too, I can spend 3 hours on. But initially, fundamentalists were people who held to the fundamentals of the faith. But by the 1930s, they turned into becoming looked at as legalists. And the new evangelicals wanted to replace the legalists with this is the new approach to evangelicalism. But World War II kind of upset that apple cart. And more can be said there as well. So maybe what we could do, I want to just wrap this up here with point 11, I think. There's so much stuff here, really. We certainly know, just go back here real quick. The effects of World War II, global power. Let me say this here. This is important here. The effects of America's global power and the church. Let me say this, and be careful how you hear me. Okay? America was known worldwide as great. Right? It defeated the evil empires of the Nazis and the imperialist Japanese. It put together a war machine in less than 3 years. Okay? War was declared on us by Japan in 41. We didn't get involved really fighting them until 42. we didn't get involved with fighting the Germans until 42, and it was all over in 45. And in 3 years, we went from the 20th most powerful military in the world to the undisputable leader in world military power. And the look of that is great. Would you like to make that again? And so what happened here, for the good of America's power, let's just look at this here real good. For the good of this effect of World War II and global power, it opened missionary. Everybody wanted Americans everywhere in the world. Americans had no problem raising funds to go on the mission fields in Africa, Southeast Asia, Japan, you name it. American missionaries were all over the place. It had somewhat a similar effect when communism fell, and I was able to go teach in, conferences in a college in Ukraine and Slovakia. Because, wow, America looks so great. Communism is so done and dumb. You know, it's done and dumb, just like Nazism is dumb and done, and so forth. So, yeah, global power can be used by God to achieve his world mission, to be salt and light. And the rest here goes without saying, the effects of social revolution. We can just imagine what I can say there. Okay? I grew up in the 60s. But then, finally, the rise of conservative evangelical Christians and a new view by the Republican Party, or at least being seized by people in the Republican Party, to be the party of God. You had Ronald Reagan, likable, laughable, honest, strong leader, and so forth. He was the leader who helped, forward the fall of the Soviet Union. And again, more can be said about that. But I want to just wrap up with this here. This 21st century spirit, technology and the search for lost humanity. Guys, there's 3 things here. The advent of computer literacy and dialogue. The information acquisition in our day and age is astounding. It has gone out and beyond our wildest dreams. And there's a book entitled The World is Flat, written by Thomas Friedman. The book is basically this. Since the year 2001, Friedman argues tech has leveled every field of society, economics, political, moral, and social. The world is flat. We can right now dial up and do a FaceTime with somebody in Tokyo if we wanted to, right? We could. I got a friend teaching pastors in Nairobi, Kenya. We can connect with him if I don't pick him up. But you get where I'm going. And the international internet community and the gospel is crazy interesting, crazy good, but also crazy bad sometimes. But here's the second spoiler alert. The West is not a factor in the world anymore. Can I say that? The West is not a factor. Yeah, we got big guns, big battleships, or aircraft carriers. We got lots of nukes, but that's not it. I don't think we're going to see a nuclear war sometimes. I think we're going to see a cyber war. Because we know right now, if everything was shut down, we'd be saying, I can't get my bank account online. Right? Do we need nuclear weapons to paralyze the world? No. This is where the beast and all that false prophet and everything else, and I'm done with my time. Let me just finish this. In rethinking all of this, how many are familiar with Francis Schaeffer's book, How Then Shall We Live? And he brought this up in 1976. You lose sight of history and what you're called to be and become, not only as a nation, but as a people of God in nations. We go back to our verse in Acts chapter 17. There's a time and a place and a purpose for all of us that God has designed. And just like dear old Tom Snook standing here in front of you, I could have never imagined me doing this in my life. And I don't know where I'm going from this point. But I'm just going to let God do it. So with all that said, hopefully to have shown you the importance to trust God and the true gospel. It's not always gone well in carrying out Christianity in America to its forefront. But it's still the best thing America can hope for, is Christians who are the perfect witness to the perfect will of God, because the gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. And though I could argue that God has used the United States in a profound and unique way in the last 250 years, I'm also convinced it ain't over till it's over. And if he was willing to spare Sodom for 10, I think we got a little bit higher than 0.00% Christians in this country. So have hope. And as we talk about these next things after a short break, let's hopefully learn something here today.